How about the People's Symphony Concert?
Yes.
Oh, $50 for 8 chamber music concerts. I'll send you a link to it. And top artists basically. Do it
All
full-
right.
it-
Are we ready?
Yeah, I'll send you. a-
Let it go. Okay, great. All right, well, oh, we have a few people still coming into through the waiting room. Greetings to everybody, both here in the room with me at the Jordan Center and to those of you joining us on Zoom. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Cristina Florea. Cristina, a graduate of Princeton, is assistant professor of history. She studies the history of Central and Eastern Europe. She is assistant professor at Cornell University. She has a book forthcoming that we're all very excited about, on which her talk will be based. The book is entitled Bukovina, The Life and Death of an Eastern European Borderland, and it's forthcoming, I believe, with Princeton University Press. You can look for it in the coming months. And one of the things that's most, I think, symptomatic of Cristina's effervescent character and her desire to share her knowledge with the world is the fact that she has written extensively for a popular audience as well as an academic one. She has popular writings that bring the history of the region she studies into public view in important ways and at important moments in our recent debates that have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Time Magazine, CNN, and Foreign Affairs. So it is our special pleasure to have Cristina present to us today. Cristina, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Jordan Center for the invitation, as well as to Sasha, who's not here today, I guess, and Fatuma Keita, who did a fabulous job of organizing all this and getting me here. So I've been working on this little place called Bukovina that I'm here to talk to you about for the past 10 years or so. And so you can imagine I'm really, really excited to finally be able to share with you what I've discovered in the process and to relate some of my research adventures here, which finally, as Anne noted, have materialized into a book. Now, as my colleagues at Cornell like to say, we in Ithaca in upstate New York basically live in the Bukovina of America. It's a place in the middle of nowhere, miles away from civilization. So it feels really good to be visiting the metropole and to see you all here. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got started. Oops, let's see if this actually works. Yes. So this is my introduction to Bukovina. I absorbed this story in part by osmosis during the summers that I spent there as a child. I grew up in Bucharest in Romania, but my grandparents lived in a little town in southern Bukovina, which for me was always associated with play and sunshine, and most importantly, the lack of homework since I was there every summer. Unlike the neighbors in Bucharest that I lived side by side with, the people who lived on my grandparents' street had really unusual sounding last names. All by unusual, I mean they didn't sound Romanian. My own grandfather's last name was Herman. 2 houses down the street, there lived a family called Freifeld. And there were also families with odd sounding names that I realized only later were actually Polish and Ukrainian in origin. But in the textbooks that we read in school in Bucharest, Bukovina came up only occasionally, and there was no explanation for any of this. Usually, it was presented either as the home to the Romanian national poet, Mihai Eminescu, or rather the place where he went to school, or sometimes as home to the large number of Orthodox monasteries that were built here in this really strange architectural style that was actually a mixture of other styles that couldn't really be found anywhere else in Romania. Now, we read that Eminescu had gone to school there in this city named Cernăuți, which was now across the border in Ukraine. So it was kind of an out of the way place that nobody really got to visit unless you made special arrangements. Years later, while I was studying history at Princeton in graduate school, I encountered Bukovina again and was really surprised to find it, this time through literature. My advisors there introduced me first to this book by Gregor von Ritsori, Memoirs of an Anti-Semite, which is a collection of sketches inspired by life in interwar Bukovina, and to Carlos Emil Franzos's Halbazien, which was a travel account written by this man I had never heard of before, a German-speaking Jewish writer who had been born in Galicia and then went to school in Bukovina. In this book, Halbazien, or Half Asia, right, that he published in 1874, Franzos described Bukovina as an oasis of civilization in the middle of a sea of backwardness. He described, for example, how after traveling for hours and hours through the Galician countryside, he found in Bukovina a place that looked to him like a mirage in the middle of the half Asian cultural desert. This is how he put it. It also struck him as a place that belonged, again, I'm citing him, in the West where Bildung, good manners, and white tablecloths could be found once more. And then he went to say something that I thought was even more interesting. As he kept traveling through Bukovina's capital, Czernowitz, Franzos felt like he was moving through several different spaces and times all at once. One part of the city, for example, reminded him of the area between, he said, the Kinzig and Neckar in Germany. Another one, the city's oldest quarter, which had been named Judenviertel, recalled the look and the feel of a Podolian ghetto. A few streets down, Franzos encountered a piece of Ukraine or Russia, as he saw an onion-domed Orthodox churches that were replacing the city's synagogues. And on top of a hill called Habsburgshöhe, Habsburg Heights. There's an idea for you for renaming some place in New York. Franzos saw the Greek Oriental Archbishop's residence, which was a building in Moorish style that reminded him of Spain. He wrote the Arab lands and the Byzantine Empire. And then even further out, as this urban landscape gave way to what he called an uninhabited steppe, Bukovina even began to look to him like the untamed American prairie. So in short, this place seemed not only out of place, but also like it belonged to several different cultural geographies at once. Now, when I first arrived there in 2014, basically 150 years later, I experienced a similar kind of disorientation. When I got off the train that I boarded in Bucharest, I stepped into this railway station that you see here that looked pretty much indistinguishable from those in any small Austrian city. But as it became clear pretty soon, I was not an Austrian. I walked up the steep street that leads from the train station to the city center, and then found myself wandering among these buildings that looked like they belonged where I had come from, in Bucharest. In continuation of that part of the city, there was this area filled with crumbling communist-era housing. Then I passed by this building, which looked from the back like a synagogue, but then turned out to be actually a synagogue where you can see still here ads of the latest blockbusters, which you would still watch. So to me too, the place felt a little bit like a mosaic made from pieces of other places that had been recycled and recombined. And this was in part because, unlike a lot of other cities in Eastern Europe, Czernowitz had not been completely razed to the ground. Each regime that ruled the province and the city, and there were many of them, as we will see, did their best to leave their imprint on it, but they often did so through addition rather than elimination. And each one of them had to contend with the physical remnants of its predecessors there. There were all kinds of material relics of the past that resisted removal and over frustrated officials who found themselves repeatedly waging wars over architecture, public monuments, street names, and even plays staged at the theater, as we'll see. Today, the place still feels a little bit like an odd kind of space that straddles borders and folds together even different epochs of time. Now, when I initially started writing this, I intended to write an urban history of Czernowitz, since that was where most of my sources were leading me, especially the literature that I already mentioned and the memoirs. But once I arrived there in the archives, I began to understand that the city alone actually wouldn't allow me to do justice to the complexity of this history. Because in fact, most of Bukovina's population lived in the countryside. And a lot of the region's history revolved around the tensions between the city and the villages. So the scope of my project expanded. And as you can imagine, the research process was pretty difficult. because Bukovina's archives, as often happens with these places that go back and forth, became scattered across several different states. Sources were often carried away by officials who evacuated the place in a hurry or were taken into exile by people who were fleeing war and occupation. And then I also found that, like the people that I was studying, I also was beginning to learn how to navigate all these different administrations and ideologies and languages, which felt really exhausting, but also really exhilarating. And what I found at the end of the day was a history that was saturated with meaning and also with contemporary relevance. Not in spite of Bukovina's marginality, as I had thought, but maybe because of it. And I also discovered a history that in many ways is particular to this place, but also echoes far beyond Eastern Europe, that connects with many other regions I discovered later, like Kashmir, Manchuria, or the Mediterranean, for example, as a whole, that served as testing grounds for state building projects that were later extended elsewhere. Now, the book that resulted from all this research is basically an English language biography of Bukovina, in which I trace the province's trajectory from when it emerged as a distinct entity in the late 18th century, when it was incorporated into the Habsburg Empire, and to the post-World War II moment when it became divided between Romania and the Soviet Union. I adopted this long temporal frame in order to trace how these successive regimes built upon, borrowed, and sometimes tried to obliterate the legacies of their predecessors. And so the result is a story not of clean breaks, but of multiple imperfect transitions and ruptures that never managed to fully erase what came before. Forms of governance that became layered on top of one another like a geological stratum. So now in what follows, I want to take you a little bit into this story, beginning with a moment when Bukovina, which at the time was one of Austria's poorest provinces, unexpectedly acquired a German language university of its own. Next, I want to visit Czernowitz, as Czernowitz was now renamed by the Romanian administration during the 1920s and 1930s, and see how this new administration tries to turn the province and the city into what they call a bastion of Romanian culture. And finally, we'll stop over Chernovtsi, as they're called it now in Russian, or Chernivtsi in Ukrainian, 1940, when the city unexpectedly came under Soviet occupation and this legion of Soviet officials descended upon northern Bukovina to launch what they called the Cultural Revolution there. So what I want to emphasize throughout is how central this concept of culture, which was referred to by different names, kultur, kultura, kulturnost, was to every regime that came there. Whether Austrian, Romanian, Soviet, these states repeatedly invoke culture both to justify their rule and define actually their governance strategies there. Often I found that culture, right, and these variations stood in for money. The grand educational reform and grandiose visions replaced infrastructure and investment that was often lacking. But most interestingly, this culture idea also provided the local population with an instrument that they used to negotiate with the states that ruled them. They used it to press their own claims, to assert visibility, often to demand inclusion, with unexpected consequences sometimes. So let's start with the first episode. I just brought up a few maps to give you a sense. This is a map from the interwar period where you see Bukovina appears on a map of Greater Romania after it was integrated. And this is after 1945, when the province, the northern part, is now under Soviet occupation. This southern part is still part of the Romanian nation state. All right, so when the Habsburgs annexed Bukovina in 1774-75 from the Principality of Moldova, which was then under Ottoman suzerainty, the land was really not that central to imperial ambitions. But even so, Emperor Joseph II, who played a key role in this annexation, believed that it was actually strategically important enough that it was worth haggling over with the Ottomans at the end of an Ottoman-Russian war. He believed that it could offer a natural bridge between two older Habsburg possessions in the region, namely Transylvania and Galicia. By the late 19th century, as the Habsburg Empire, which had been reinvented as Austria-Hungary after 1867, by this point, right, as the empire sought to redefine its place in Europe after losing its position as the hegemonic German power, Bukovina came to matter in a new way. Austrian liberals, who were at the helm of government since the 1860s, began to articulate a new cultural mission for Austria, the Kulturmission, as they called it in Eastern Europe. So Bukovina, a poor and peripheral province of the empire, seemed like the ideal proving ground for this new mission. Most of its population lived scattered across the countryside, lived barely above subsistence level. By the 1870s, for example, Bukovina contributed less than 1.1% of the empire's annual budget and actually received even less in return. Its economy, as I mentioned, was heavily agricultural, and its schools were makeshift. And the province actually registers some of the highest illiteracy levels and lowest levels of school attendance in the empire. One teacher, for example, complained that students were often meeting in improvised classrooms in stables that were covered with fungus and had no time to do their homework because their parents had to spend hours cleaning them up, right, once they returned home. Another one, it's my personal favorite, reported that Bukovinan peasants stubbornly refused to send their children to schools because they believed schools were an evil concocted by Beelzebub for the misery of the people. So in 1875, bear all this in mind, right? In 1875, Bukovina's capital became the site of a new German language university that was named in honor of Emperor Franz Joseph. A group of local elites, and foremost among them was this man that I showed you here, Constantin Tomaschuk, who was an Austrian liberal from a mixed Romanian-Ruthenian family. This group of elites petitioned for a university for Bukovina. And curiously, Tomaschuk, above all, insisted that the university offer classes in German rather than in Bukovina's other languages, as petitioners elsewhere in the empire were beginning to do at the time. He insisted that a German language university, especially in a remote place like this, would act as a spiritual lighthouse, this is how he put it, providing equal access to education to all of Bukovina's nationalities. He also believed that through Bildung, this concept of education, and Kultur, such a university would also help bind together the province's centrifugal forces. And in this way, basically lay the basis for state unity. The emperor approved the petition, but he actually declined to attend the opening ceremony, invoking the monarchy's strained budget as an excuse. The inauguration nevertheless took place, and it was timed to coincide with the 150th anniversary of Habsburg rule in Bukovina. This was evidently an attempt to show that Austrian rule had always evolved around this enlightenment and civilization mission. And the university's first dean declared that the new institution proved Austria ruled not by force, but, and here I cite, by humanity, tolerance, work, and loyalty to the royal house. Now, the reality fell short of these ambitions because the university opened that fall without a dedicated building, and students and faculty wandered actually from one place to another, from room to room. Classes were held often in unheated spaces, and students wrote on cardboard boxes instead of desks. Professors from across the empire who took up positions here often described their time in Chernovitz as academic exile. Some of them likened the university with a penal colony, actually. Among them was a legal scholar, Eugen Ehrlich. Now, symbolically, the university mattered. It brought some attention and opportunities to a province that was beginning to feel overlooked by the empire. And it did also attract a new generation of students, many of them local and the first in their families to pursue higher education. But their exposure to this culture, right, within the university did not actually bind them necessarily to those universalist aspirations that liberals like Tomaschuk held dear. Many became leaders of nationalist movements later, that came to criticize this premise that German could serve actually as a universal language. Among them was a man named Ion Nistor, a Romanian historian, who graduated from the university and founded a new literary publication, around which he gathered other first-generation university graduates, many of whom were from Romanian teachers and priest families. He and his circle started arguing that this culture that people like Tomașciuc upheld served only some, above all German-speaking Jews, while leaving Romanians and Ruthenians, or Ukrainians, who actually did not speak German at home, at a disadvantage. They insisted that the illiteracy and the poverty which afflicted Bukovina's rural population were not their own failings or necessarily the product of economic policy, but the result of this structural cultural exclusion. So this culture concept that people like Tomașciuc imagined as a kind of universal solvent was now recast as a tool of dominance. Instead of culture, Nistor began singing the praises of Romanian culture. He urged other Romanians, especially educated ones, to wean themselves off foreign culture. He called them the descendants of the Latin race at the gates of the Orient. So for his followers, culture became the solution, reimagined right along national lines, became the solution to national stagnation and disunity. A member of his circle, for example, wrote that an intensive cultural movement would be the glue that ties us together, bringing about the much needed reconciliation within the bosom of our society, which today is fractured. So by the turn of the century, these nationalist critiques of Austria's cultural mission began taking sharper forms. Immigration from rural Bukovina surged, and local nationalists began blaming this exodus, particularly on Jewish Studierwut, as they call it, or almost like study fury. The fact that Jewish students seemed very eager to crowd into these German language schools and university, supposedly leaving the Christians in Bukovina to do menial jobs. So national solutions to the problem was, however, not really to reject culture altogether, but to fight over it. So they began demanding more schools, more access, more instruction for their own connationals. Culture's critics began judging their own progress by some of its standards. And here you see Eugen Ehrlich, who I mentioned before, this later to become famous legal scholar, who had been teaching at the university in Chernobyl since 1899, and who reflected on this paradox in this way. He writes, "It is quite curious that both peoples, Romanians and Ruthenians, first think about founding as many gymnasium or gymnasiums as possible. This he contrasted with actual economic measures. No nationalists there wanted their respective nationalities to be underrepresented in the prestigious schools. And when a German politician suggested a more practical education for Ruthenians and Romanians, for example, a curriculum that would emphasize agricultural education, the Ukrainian nationalist, you see here, Nicolae von Vasilko, snapped at him, saying, while the Germans eat the apple themselves, they want the Romanians and the Ruthenians to eat the peel only. We're supposed to remain nations of shoemakers and tailors who feed the civil servants coming here from abroad." So in short, this culture idea inspired dreams of interethnic harmony in the empire's remotest borderland, but also began providing these local elites with a vocabulary with which to air new grievances. And so it left a pretty deep imprint on both those who embraced it, like Tomașciuc, and those who began turning against it, because even though they rejected that imperial standard, they continued to measure themselves against it, as we'll see also in this next episode, in which we look at the city in Bukovina after 1918, when Austro-Hungary collapsed and the world that all of these people had taken for granted suddenly came crashing down. Cultural and intellectual elites in the province and ordinary people found themselves navigating the first of many regime changes to come. And as the monarchy's armies began disintegrating, Bukovina became the object of competing claims. Romanians and Ukrainians were the two largest groups in the province, both demanded it for their respective nation states. The Ukrainian army soon got distracted by the onset of a war with the Poles in Galicia, and so they abandoned the province after briefly occupying administrative buildings in the capital. And then a Romanian politician named Iancu Flondor appealed to the Romanian government, which was at the time was still in exile in Iași, to send troops into Bukovina allegedly to restore order. And so by the end of 1918, Bukovina actually was incorporated into Romania. And the annexation was not formally recognized until the Paris Peace Conference, but the Romanian state asserted de facto control in the province. The most radical Romanian nationalists there, people like Nistor, that you already met, had left the province for Bucharest during the war. When they got there, they immediately started contributing to Romania's anti-Austrian propaganda efforts. But most cultural and intellectual elites actually stayed behind. Ion Nistor returned now with the Romanian administration into Bukovina and was shortly afterwards appointed minister delegate of the province. Side by side with him, Bukovina was represented in the new Romanian administration by Iancu Flondor, the man who summoned the Romanian troops in 1918. And here you have a picture of this greater congress that Flondor presided over, where delegates from Bukovina voted for unification with Romania. Okay. So nationalists like Nistor, who you see here, Flondor too, and especially their inspiration, the Romanian historian Nicolae Iorga, who maybe some of you might know as the author of Byzantium after Byzantium, wrote a good deal about, and he also wrote a good deal about the province. Them believed that culture was not something to be taught or transmitted, but something organic and innate. And now Iorga, in particular, thought that the culture that the Habsburgs had attempted to build in Bukovina was deformed or stunted in its development. The empire that built it could not be regretted, according to him, any more than Don Quixote's Rocinante, who passed away sticking its long tongue out by the side of the road. This is how he put it. Nistor also echoed Iorga, insisting that anything of value in Bukovina stemmed from the native genius of Moldavia, whereas Habsburg governance had remained eternally foreign to the land. So he was convinced that even after centuries of foreign rule, all one had to do was to remove that outer layer of imperial culture to reveal the national essence that had remained uncorrupted by foreign influence. And here he said, everything that has been preserved in Bukovina in terms of monuments of art emanated from the vigor of the creative spirit of our Moldavian ancestors. Habsburg rule was and remained eternally foreign to this land. But in the next few months and years, this fiction of continuity proved quite difficult to uphold. Romanian officials coming in from Bucharest came in with very high expectations and often a sense of superiority, and were surprised to find that Bukovina looked and felt, as they described it, foreign, and that many people here, including ethnic Romanians, actually looked down upon them. The endurance of the empire in Bukovina revealed itself not only in street names that people continued using, architectural facades, but also in the texture of daily life. The German language, despite repeated language regulations that were designed to make Romanian the official language, not only in theory, but also in practice, the German language just refused to fade. It remained the main medium of conversation in cafes, in streets of Chernovitz, in public, kind of like glue within public life. A few years already into Romanian rule, officials complained that many roads in Bukovina still bore the marks of Habsburg rule. They found wooden poles, for example, painted in imperial yellow and black, lining provincial routes. Government buildings and coffee houses lacked the necessary portraits of Romania's royal family. Instead, what they saw hanging on walls were still paintings of the Central Power's military triumphs. Passers-by wore emblems bearing the likenesses of Emperors Wilhelm and Franz Joseph. In some corners of the province, and especially in the city, it began to look like time had stopped. And the place became suspended in a strange alternate chronology where the monarchy had never collapsed and the war had not been lost. Now, faced with this kind of inertia, the Romanian authorities began renaming streets, replacing monuments in an effort to write the nation into Bukovina's landscape. And here you see an old part of the theater right in the center of Chernovitz. Probably can't tell, but there's a statue there of Friedrich Schiller, who was the namesake of this grand theater. In 1922, this statue was sneakily removed and tucked away in the courtyard of the German National Home. Now, Friedrich Schiller became officially German national, so he had to be put in the courtyard of the German National Home. In its place, the new administration put in a statue of the Romanian poet Mihai Eminescu, who I started with. Franz Josef's Garden Street became Arboroasa Street, named after a Romanian student club. Austriaplatz became Grigore Ghica Voda Square after the Phanariot prince basically was ruling when Bukovina was handed over to Austria. Hauptstrasse became King Ferdinand Street. And the most theatrical gesture of all came when the administration installed a statue of a bison, or ox, some would describe it, in the city's former Linkplatz. This was a central square, now renamed Unification Square. It might seem a little bit odd, but this bison was actually a reference to medieval Moldavia. It was a symbol of it. And here you can see, but he was depicted trampling underfoot the double-headed Austrian eagle. So the message was pretty clear, right? The empire was dead and Romania represented through the bison, right, ruled in its stead. Here you have a picture with three men in Chernovitz posing before this bison. Well, before long, this statue became a kind of object of hilarity. A lot of non-Romanian speakers in Chernovitz, certain groups of them does not know who exactly did it, went at one point and tied a bag of hay around the bison's head and then scribbled underneath, I don't know if anybody speaks Romanian here, but Romania mare mămăligă n-are, meaning Greater Romania has no polenta, through which they were making fun basically of Romania's great cultural ambitions and the reality that, you know, everyday life seemed to be kind of a downturn. Now, these gestures were part of a larger mission, not just to govern, but to undo what had been done before, to reverse what nationalists like the ones that I presented here saw as decades of injustice and cultural distortion. Bukovina's new administration drew legitimacy in part from the promise that the Romanian rural majority in the province would no longer be left to linger at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Nationalists like Nistor or Flondor celebrated the peasantry as a symbol of purity. Peasant culture was to them authentic by definition, while urban culture was compromised, polyglot, impure, artificial. At the same time, though, those nationalists who celebrated the rural as morally superior also believed that peasants needed, in fact, to be educated, modernized, and uplifted. So Ioan Nistor, who is now a government official, acknowledged that, as he put it, in our country, large masses of people, and the peasantry above all, are in a great state of cultural inferiority. And this was now not just simply kind of moral failing. It was a really embarrassing thing. It was even a political liability, they thought. Because if Romanian peasants in Bukovina remained culturally and economically inferior to non-Romanians, then the national revolution had failed to deliver. And even more, the government was afraid that in a borderland province like this, that was situated just across a river from the Soviet Union, the rural population, left behind first by the empire, then by the nation state, would become susceptible to the spread of Bolshevism. In response, Romania's liberal governments, which stayed in power throughout the 1920s, launched a series of literacy campaigns that now targeted the countryside. They started building public libraries in villages, always with really minimal budgets. In 1925, a frustrated high school principal reported that his school's library still contained only Austrian materials and no Romanian books at all. And in practice, here's where it gets interesting, it was still the cities that drew the most attention. And cultural institutions built under imperial rule, especially the university and the theater that you just saw, were really cherished cultural venues, especially for the city's German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie. Several years after Bukovina was incorporated into Romania, audiences continued flocking to German language performances in Chernobyl. And so one evening in 1922, during the production of Schiller's The Robbers, a group of Romanian nationalist students decided to take the theater by storm. And they broke into the foyer, smashed the glass display cabinets, and here's my favorite detail, they stole the chocolates right inside. The Jewish director then received anonymous threats. So the theater was both a source of envy and the target of national reform. So a few days later, it was renamed Teatrul Național, National Theater, and a new director was appointed, a Romanian, who now declared triumphantly that at last real cultural work could be done here. However, by the 1930s, disappointment had begun to set in because all these grandiose promises of national transformation of the early 1920s had yielded really meager results. The theaters had failed to transform into bastions of Romanian culture. The streets still echoed with foreign languages. And culture, invoked previously to elevate and unify the nation, became now once again a means of critique that first non-Romanians wielded in Bukovina and then later increasingly also Romanians. At first, non-Romanian elites protested centralization policies, for example, from Bucharest, by insisting that Bukovina was culturally superior to its new capital, precisely because the people there had been raised on Schiller and Goethe. Bucharest, they said, by contrast, bore the imprint of centuries of Ottoman misrule. It was corrupt, Balkan, and culturally inferior. By contrast, Bukovina had been shaped by thoroughly superior, they thought, Austrian schooling and administrative culture. So for them, Bukovina's cultureness became increasingly both a badge of distinction and a kind of language of resistance with which they began articulating their regional interests. And here comes the surprise. The Romanian politician Iancu Flundor that I presented, the guy who invited the Romanian troops in, who was a nationalist by any measure, now began proposing that a cordon sanitaire, a kind of like sanitary barrier, should be erected to shield the province from the Balkan influences, right, from Bucharest. Bukovina, he now insisted, should be allowed to change the nation state, not simply to be changed by it. And as the decade wore on, frustrations with the slow pace of change or the quality of change, depending on one's perspective, actually grew even deeper. Many Romanians in Bukovina, especially university-educated youth, became increasingly disillusioned with the national government's failures, not only to integrate the province more firmly into the nation state, but also to realize those many promises of 1918. Here's, I forgot to show you this, one of the pictures of peasants, the ideal type here shown actually posing in front of a monastery. So all of these people who had expected the national government to right all alleged past wrongs, to close the gaps between Romanians and minorities, were increasingly disappointed. What had been hailed as a great union now appeared to them increasingly as a botched project. In 1922, a young Mircea Eliade, who you see here, historian of religions, who soon became an intellectual sympathizer of Romania's fascist movement, the Legion of Archangel Michael, also known as the Iron Guard. Well, this is what he wrote about Chernobyl, which he visited them. It's a beautiful city situated on hills that possesses 2% Romanians who know Romanian. You can't imagine what pleasure it gave me to hear two peasants speaking Romanian. It was the first time I was hearing the language in Chernobyl. And even a decade later, right, in 1930, Romanians still comprise only 27% of Chernobyl's population. And German-speaking Jews still dominated the liberal professions and many of the city's trades. So for national critics of the interwar liberal government like Eliade, the province began to, or rather they appealed to the province to make an argument for why much more aggressive nationalization policies were necessary. To them, this province was also living proof that liberalism had basically failed. It had outlived its usefulness. The 1930s, as I alluded to now, saw the rise of the Legion of Archangel Michael, better known as the Legionary Movement, a variety of fascism, nationalistic, anti-Semitic, paramilitary organization. In Bukovina, some Romanians, but also non-Romanians, especially Ukrainians and Germans, were drawn to its message of national renewal and purification. At the university in Chernobyl, a hub of legionary activity emerged around this guy you see here, a professor named Traian Brăilean, who gathered around him a group of radicalized students. He launched a publication in which he denounced urban civilization and idealized the peasant as the authentic bearer of national Romanian culture. He also denounced cities like Chernobyl as, here's how he put it, little more than Jewish colonies into which a few Romanians have strayed. In 1933, members of another organization on the radical right, the League of National Christian Defense, which was much more attractive to people in the countryside, and was led by university professor from Iași, began attacking Jewish-owned shops in Chernobyl. And that same night, they stormed the city theater. Jewish actors were performing on stage in German when the windows were smashed, tear gas was thrown, and rotten eggs rained out. The Romanian government wanted to regain control over these increasingly radical and unexpected elements, and they did so by increasingly mimicking some of their actions. In 1938, for example, a new constitution was adopted, which now included language mandates, much harsher than before, absolutely banning the use of foreign languages and proclaiming this as the onset of a new cultural epoch for Romania. So, as the Romanian state tried to redefine itself yet again, the ground beneath it started shifting. Because in June 1940, as I alluded to earlier, the Soviet Union presented Romania with an ultimatum. Northern Bukovina and Bessarabia, a province that Bukovina had incorporated from the Russian Empire in 1918, were to be ceded to the Soviets within the next 24 hours. So the nation-state's new cultural epoch had to be put on hold. And so now we move on to the last episode here. Here you see the obligatory pictures showing how the Soviets were greeted upon entering northern Bukovina by the very eager masses. So the Soviets, in fact, entered northern Bukovina earlier than scheduled. And in doing that, they ended up catching straggling Romanian units, government officials mid-retreat, and throwing everybody into a panic. In just a few days, Romania ended up losing a significant portion of the territories it had acquired in 1918. The first Soviet tanks reached Chernobyl, now renamed first Chernovtsi, then Chernivtsi, in early July 1940. Moscow reported the event in the Pravda, in Izvestia, and justified the invasion as an intervention on behalf of Bukovina's Ukrainians. Because northern Bukovina, as they claimed, was the last missing piece of Ukraine, and its incorporation into Soviet Ukraine would compensate the long-delayed unity of the Ukrainian nation, as it was reimagined now by the Soviet state. It might seem odd a little bit, right, that this state stretching over so many time zones would bother with a small place like this. But to them too, this place became above all symbolically significant. Its annexation basically marked a further advance of the socialist world into Central Europe. And so in absorbing northern Bukovina, the Soviets tried not only to gain this little sliver of land, but also envisioned that they're moving closer to fulfilling that older ambition to bring the revolution into the heart of Europe. But the Soviets, like the Romanians before them, had mixed feelings about Bukovina. They approached it both with a kind of revolutionary determination and zeal, but also with a good deal of distrust. Because with Bukovina, they had just swallowed a territory that had been ruled until very recently by a capitalist and anti-communist regime. And so, like their predecessors, they viewed the province as a proving ground for their own model of governance. Curiously, they prioritized from the very outset what they called kulturность, which they insisted was the prime marker of Soviet rule. Unfortunately, they had very limited material resources and they were operating in a totally devastated economy. And yet, they eagerly opened new libraries, reading rooms, and film clubs all over the countryside. They staged plays, they sent agitators to villages with mobile cinemas, determined to enlighten the masses, whose ignorance they now blamed on 2 decades of Romanian imperialism. So where those Romanian nationalists had once argued that culture would help inoculate Bukovina's peasants against socialism, Soviet officials now insisted that literacy and culture was the first step towards building socialism. They were also haunted, though, by the fear that they may appear to locals as provincial, crude, or even illegitimate. And reports from the time show Soviet administrators in northern Bukovina were obsessively counting and reporting, as they did a lot everywhere they went, on the number of reading societies, music circles they founded, the number of Ukrainian language books published and distributed, how many theater performances they staged. What also becomes clear when reading these reports, though, is that Soviet officials often struggled to define what the socialist culture actually meant in practice. And much of what was rolled out bore the marks of improvisation. Officials kind of swung back and forth between making compromises with what they called enemy elements, because there were so few ideologically pure elements in Bukovina, and attempted to eliminate those elements entirely. They were also really anxious about contamination, both ideological and cultural. They fretted, for example, that the local population's bad habits would rub off on the authorities too. And locals, for their part, also viewed these new arrivals with contempt. Those in particular who remember the Russian occupations in the First World War expected the worst. They were ready to see deportations, executions, and hunger. So many actually fled before the Red Army even arrived. Those who stayed, not all, but many of them, described the Soviets as uncultured and coarse, an impression which they often repeated in a lot of memoirs and testimonies. A Romanian actor from Bukovina, Pepe Georgescu, who was a staunch anti-Bolshevik, recalled, for example, seeing Soviet soldiers running down Chernobyl streets, and here I'm citing from him, biting on a piece of salami and one of chocolate, their rucksacks apparently stuffed with stolen candy and cakes. One railway worker from Bukovina tried to befriend a Soviet sentinel who had been sent to guard his locomotive by offering him some of his oranges for lunch. And so when asked if oranges were in fact available in Russia too, the sentinel apparently responded, "Oh yes, we have it in Moscow, 2 whole factories that make them." The railway worker concluded from this that the Soviets were clearly in their sight illiterate, and such people were claiming to bring us culture. Right, and here you see some of when the Romanians return later, they start documenting a lot of this. They write here, Bolsheviks set homes in Chernobyl on fire, the destruction and unculturedness of the Soviets. Now, one of the most striking aspects of Soviet rule in northern Bukovina in 1940 was how the new authorities actually approached the national question in this province that was so multi-ethnic. After more than 2 decades of those nationalization and Romanianization efforts, the Soviets all of a sudden reversed the ethnic and cultural hierarchy in Bukovina. They confidently proclaimed Ukrainians this time around to be Bukovina's original native population. They reinterpreted ethnic conflict between Romanians and Ukrainians in both groups that, as I said, had territorial claims to the land in terms of class. Ukrainians were cast as the oppressed proletariat, while Romanians were by default imperialist landlords and class enemies. So as a result, Ukrainian was also proclaimed the official language of government and culture in this district, now renamed Chernivtsi Oblast. And Northern Bukovina's official newspaper was now printed in Ukrainian. Ukrainian literature was promoted as never before, and Ukrainian language instruction immediately expanded in schools. In practice, though, many of the Soviet officials who recently arrived here, a lot of them were from the eastern regions of Soviet Ukraine, actually continued using Russian in practice and dismissing Ukrainian as a backward provincial dialect. The first secretary of the Chernivtsi administrative body called Obkom made phone calls to various institutions in the oblast and discovered right upon doing that officials, and here I cite, stubbornly respond in Russian, which shows that in our institutions the dominant language is still Russian. And this was something that he insisted his subordinates needed to set right immediately. Still, Soviet officials in northern Bukovina remained committed to presenting Soviet socialism as the natural apex of the province's Ukrainian past. The Ukrainian bard Taras Shevchenko was reimagined as a proto-communist. The Bukovinan Hutzul poet Yuri Fedkovich was similarly drafted into a kind of pantheon of revolutionary authors. And most notably, Soviet officials co-opted this Ukrainian Bukovinan writer, Olga Kobolyanska, to bolster the regime's legitimacy. Kobolyanska had been born actually into a family that spoke Polish and German at home. She began her literary career writing in German and only later adopted Ukrainian after befriending a Galician Ukrainian poet, Lesia Ukraina. Her complicated past was conveniently omitted. At the time, she was pretty elderly and incapacitated, but nevertheless, she was now invited to pose for photographs with Soviet officials. And the newspaper, Agentska Bukovina, now published a carefully worded appeal in her name, urging locals to take part in the Soviet elections. And here's how it goes. The Soviet Union's fierce enemies spoke and wrote completely untrue things about the Bolsheviks, people who lead all workers to a better life. I have heard with great enthusiasm many lectures about Shevchenko, Pushkin, Franco. I was very happy to witness the great flourishing of Ukrainian Soviet culture. How many happy minutes I experienced when the radio broadcast Ukrainian popular songs that one used to be sent to prison for singing. Whether she actually wrote the message or even approved of it, we don't really know. But what mattered was that this local heroine, who most people would have known as a feminist, a Ukrainian, and now also a socialist, had just given the new regime her blessing. By the summer of 1941, so barely a year later, the Soviets were also on the run, and their cultural revolution had to be put on hold too. Because the Romanian troops, now joined by their ally Nazi Germany, came in from the south and reoccupied northern Bukovina, launching yet another experiment in governance, this time one that aimed at nationalizing the province for good, this time through racial purification. I won't get into that, but I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested. So let me wrap up with a few thoughts about what all of this is about. These were only 3 episodes of many such moments that I tried to bring together into a kind of overarching narrative that makes several interlocking arguments. As we just saw here, each regime that ruled Bukovina in succession arrived there with a cultural mission. Regimes that define themselves often in opposition to each other, for example, the Romanian and the Habsburg, imperial versus national, or liberal versus authoritarian, all invoked this so-called cultural mission and often resorted to cultural policies to bring about this transformation of the province into a kind of mirror image of themselves, or rather their ideal selves. Bringing their projects together and looking at them side by side reveals the echoes and the kinds of entanglements that span these ideological and temporal divides. The different states that tried their hand at ruling Bukovina borrowed often from one another, whether consciously or not. They absorbed each other's legacies even when they tried very hard to erase them from their memory and from locals' memory. So Bukovina, and by extension, I think Eastern Europe, became in this way a site where states remade or redefined themselves through interactions and encounters both with their predecessors and rivals. The stories we see here are also ultimately, I think, about the search for modernity and its contradictions. The Habsburgs, the Romanian nation state, the Soviet Union, wartime Romania, then allied with Nazi Germany, all really believed that a radical, total transformation was possible. Some of them promised that they would drag, if necessary, Bukovina into modernity. Others, even those who tried to resurrect Bukovina's lost past, modernized it all the same, like the nationalists. Most regimes imagine themselves, as we've seen, as correcting the errors of their predecessors. And some, like the Soviets, were more effective than others at bringing about actual ruptures. But transformation didn't always come from above. many locals who were positioned, or rather they saw themselves as being positioned in a kind of in-between space, often sought to draw the states in. They believed that this position gave them a vantage point that was special. They wanted inclusion often, and also to benefit from the state's infrastructure and resources. So often we find them actually inviting the state-driven interventions that eventually reshape them. Bukovina, as I try to show here, underwent not just one of these revolutions, but several. Though I think it might be more accurate to speak of this in terms of cycles of reinvention, of recycling, of reappropriation. And I was fortunate to witness one of these moments in 2014 when I arrived there and saw all these young Ukrainians in Chernivtsi, many of them galvanized by the Euromaidan protests, gathered around a statue of Emperor Franz Josef. So Emperor Franz Josef suddenly returned, now put here in one of the city squares by a kind of European-friendly mayor. As you see here, unfortunately, Franz Josef got punished by the rival faction who was going around the city painting Russian flags on tree trunks, who also decided to spill red ink or red paint on him. So once again, you got to see there how this region's past were being selectively recuperated, reimagined, and also pulled back in to speak to the present. These fragments of the past, material and symbolic, were once again reconfigured to build this new vision of where the place belonged. And my personal favorite is when I was surrounded by these people in the square and I asked somebody, oh, do you mind if I speak Russian? I hope it's okay. And they said, oh, no, we're very tolerant here. We were under the Habsburgs. And this was a person whose grandparents had come from Eastern Soviet Ukraine. So no direct connection. Now, much of the literature historians have produced on Eastern Europe has been preoccupied with challenging these stereotypes of the region's marginality and backwardness. And while that perspective is really important, what I wanted to do here is to begin with what the people and the institutions that inhabited this place, how they viewed themselves, what they hoped for, and kind of what they imagined, right, their place in the world to be. And as far as I can tell, I guess what I noticed is that Bukovinans actually were always haunted by what they perceived to be their marginal status, but also convinced that that marginality actually gave them a clear understanding of the world. And also, while a lot of this literature on borderlands that I've read emphasized the fluidity or sometimes the apoliticism even of populations there, what I found here was often deep engagement with states. Bukovinans, as we've seen, didn't always try to escape or evade state power, but they often demanded it, invited it in, used its rhetoric and institutions to reshape their own place in the world. And so, more broadly, I hope that with this book, I will draw attention to the complexity and also the significance of these small, seemingly marginal places. Bukovina, you might look for it on the map, but you won't find it anymore. It's sat at the crossroads, as we've seen, of so many imperial and national projects. So many crucial encounters took place there between states and the people they ruled that later proved formative for those states and their projects elsewhere on the continent. And at a time when, as you see here, Ukrainians and Chernivtsi are beginning again to reshuffle some material culture, removing old Soviet monuments. At a time when increasingly easy narratives about the region are once again very tempting, I hope this story will serve as a reminder of also how central the act of retelling repeatedly the region's history has been to every regime that sought to remake it. Thank you so much for your attention. This is what I have.
Right, Cristina, thank you so much. I was just logging in. I can't see the chat actually, just being on the Zoom, but we'll start with questions in person. And then for those of you who may have questions on Zoom, if you could please leave them in the chat and we will read them out for you here.
Yep. We can keep there then. That's fine.
Great. All right. So questions from the room. Larry, we'll begin with you. Thank you.
Really fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about Habsburg legacy and memory. You had just cited someone saying to you We were under the Habsburgs, but at that point, it was already almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
By the time, when the Soviets come to Chernivtsi in 1940, right, the Habsburgs have only been gone for 22 years, right? That's less time than, say, the distance between the current moment and September 11th, 2001. So it's really recent memory, and must be in the memory of everyone who's a middle-aged adult at that moment.
You mean 1940?
1940,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I'm interested in what we can say about how the memory and understanding of the Habsburg past has changed over the course of some 20 years of Romanian rule, and to what extent it's a living memory at that point, and whether it plays some political role in the refashioning of the province that takes place over the course of the war. In
You mean
relation
World
to
War II? No?
Yes.
Okay.
World War II. The second question I wanted to ask was about Jews, and I guess it's a question of whether we should understand from the way that you presented this, that Jews in some sense are represent a kind of metonymy for the Habsburg monarchy, and that those who are hostile to the idea of the Habsburg past are anti-Semitic in relation to the perceived connection of Jews to the Habsburg past, or whether it works the other way around, that is to say, whether it's anti-Semitism itself that creates negative feelings towards the Habsburg past, that is to say, which way the negative influences work. And the third question about Habsburg legacy is just the physical question of the architectural place. I mean, you showed us the train station, you showed us the theater there, classic Habsburg secession buildings, both of them. I'm a little interested in how we understand the way that the physical space shapes the persistence of Habsburg memory and legacy.
Oh, thank you so much. These are amazing questions. I'm so lucky to be here. This is great. Okay, so I will start with the first one about how Habsburg memory changed over the course of the 20 years of Romanian rule, right? Yes, one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of former critics, actually, of Habsburg nationality policies now begin invoking Habsburg nationality policies to demand more rights from the Romanians. And you're talking about the Ukrainians, for example, who say, hey, there was Article 19 before, so we could have our own school, so we need to just reinstitute what we had before. So it's very funny, there's this switch. The other thing that's very interesting is, you asked to think about how Jews become a metonymy for the Habsburg Empire. In a way, also the Habsburg legacy, I think, becomes like a nucleus for a kind of regional identity that I'm not sure was that strong before. And that crystallizes in the interwar period, where you see increasingly actually people of all language groups and all ethnicities mobilizing these arguments, right, about Bukovina's exposure to these imperial institutions, to imperial culture and so on, to make an argument about why there is something coherent about it that all of them share, and that decentralization policies, the more aggressive they get, the more people are nostalgic for that older order that allowed them to have some measure of autonomy, that they're now feeling like they're losing, right, repeatedly. And there's so many funny anecdotes. I remember also with people, like Romanians, for example, making fun of Bukovinans. They would show up somewhere in a public building and they say, what is this, a hospital? Everybody has the word doctor written by their because they still hold on to this identity and they're a doctor, professor, or whatever, that now seems absurd. So that's the first part. The second part, yes, this is so interesting. So what I'm trying to do now actually is kind of figure out what I think about a version of your questions about the direction. Is it anti-Semitism that leads to critique of the Habsburg, or the other way around? One thing that I find very interesting is these right-wing movements that become increasingly popular, right? Actually, the Legion of Archangel Michael more so among intellectuals, the other one that I mentioned more in the countryside. A lot of them actually frame what they're doing as almost like an anti-imperial project. And so in doing that, I mean, I don't know which direction it flows in, but their whole idea is basically the reason for attacking Jews there, which they do increasingly, is that Jews are like these stubborn relics of imperial rule. And so they increasingly identify these people and they repeatedly write out what is wrong with them. They keep speaking German. They keep doing this is like little pieces of that old order that won't go away. And so it seems like this critique of imperial rule or the failure of the empire to disappear and the anti-Semitic dimension to what they're doing really go hand in hand. My instinct is to say there's definitely, in the case of Bukovina, not just plain religious or economic anti-Semitism, but what you said also about the anti-imperial dimension, the stubbornness of that empire to just refusal to disappear. About the physical space, this one is really interesting precisely because there are all these different layers side by side. So one of the things that I found actually myself that was very interesting while walking there down the street, I found a lot of buildings where the paint had started chipping and it revealed Habsburg era, for example, script or names of stores and so on. And a lot of people are now beginning, in fact, to put paint on that. How should I explain it? They're basically like reclaiming that script that has resurfaced and refreshing the paint, right? And kind of like bringing it back into the present to match the new sort of Vienna cafes and all of these things that are popping up all over the place. I think a lot of the people, at least in the interwar period, I think the landscape that you mentioned actually plays a huge role. The remains of this material culture that makes people feel like they're with one foot in one place and one on the other, so that it's not just those who directly experienced Habsburg rule, but those who were born, let's say, in 1914 or 1918, who increasingly see themselves, right, as, oh, this was a Habsburg place, right, even though they themselves have no personal memory of it. But it's always because of inhabiting this place that keeps the region anchored in this other kind of cultural space. Yeah, anyway, these are sort of like imperfect attempts to respond, but thanks so much for the question.
So a couple of questions, all in this general range of comparing the Bukovinian experience to other places. On the anti-Semitism question, what you said about the Jews being the last remnant of colonialism reminds me a lot of what I've read about the Sri Lankan civil conflict, where the Tamils were brought in to occupy political positions and so on in Sri Lanka. And they remained there and remained a significant part of the Sri Lankan population, and subsequently were subject to massive attacks, resulting eventually in a civil war. So a quick reading of that might give you some comparative idea. The other comparative thing that struck me was there's a really interesting book about Wrocław by Gregor Thum, which is about how the Polish learned to love, which was essentially a German city, by reinventing their past, the Piast past, and highlighting that in contrast to the numerous centuries under German rule in between. So here are these people, Polish people, many from Western Ukraine, moving into this place, living surrounded by German buildings, but learning to reinvent a sort of history that makes this a Polish place. So I don't know if that dimension exists for Ukrainians in this case too. And the third little point that you can respond is that I had an interesting experience in Timișoara, which might have elements of a similar history, where there was a theater which has Hungarian theater, Romanian theater, and Hungarian, Romanian, and German theater in the middle of Timișoara. And I actually saw a Norwegian play wearing headphones, giving a simultaneous translation in Romanian. So that's another way of recreating the past. So I'm curious with these different experiences. That would have been truly a metaphor for. So I'm just trying to get what happened in Bukovina in a comparative perspective to similar experiences that might have existed.
Thank you so much for the Tamil case. I didn't know about that. That's really interesting. I think it really kind of matches sort of what I was trying to say about them being regarded as relics of imperial rule. But what you said about Wrocław and people sort of like remaking the place's history even while they're surrounded. One thing that's really interesting here that's also kind of paradoxical is some of these nationalists who come in, they criticize a lot, for example, the Austrian administration's attempt to restore some of the old Moldavian buildings or monasteries, because they had like a whole conservation department, which was the only reason, honestly, why a lot of the old sort of pre-modern monasteries are still there, because many locals apparently had started carrying away stones or like pieces of the churches and building them into their own buildings. So a lot of these nationalists were looking to ruins, for example, not surprisingly, ruins of the medieval fortresses or monasteries or so, and building kind of around those remains of that former or that non-Austrian past, basically, and complaining a lot actually how they discovered that even a lot of those had been tainted, right, by Austrian rule, because the Austrians had repainted them or restored them or whatever. But for them, I think it is really a problem, right? That there are these things like right in the heart of the city, this Schiller that's thrown in, it seems like a threat, right? That it's still there and they still go there and you know, perform all these German language plays. And so they're really intent on making that place Romanian and taking it, they take it by storm essentially, repeatedly, right? In the 1920s, 1930s. And so your example, the Timișoara example, were you asking whether there were similar bilingual?
No, are there conscious efforts to valorize the multilingual past, like in Timișoara?
Oh, you mean now?
No.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah,
yeah.
I think so. So now there's a big, for example, a big poetry festival that used to take place there that sought to kind of like put at least the city back on the map. Because it's best known probably for being where poet Paul Celan was born, and so they kind of built around this idea of Paul Celan's legacy, a big international poetry festival. And another way, actually, I think, in which it was always a very well-known fact that this is a very multilingual place, and some tried to capitalize on it, is that in 1908, for example, there was a big Yiddish language conference that a lot of these Yiddishists decided to hold in Czernowitz, because as they put it, oh, well, here's a place where you walk down the street and you hear 5 different languages being spoken, so surely there'll be understanding for Yiddish too. And actually there wasn't that much, because they really wanted to distance themselves from the Yiddish language. The head of the Jewish community preferred, right, to make it very clear that this is a German-speaking community. But yeah, that's what I would say. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I had, thank you for your presentation. I'm supposed to go there next week.
Oh.
Slovenia, so maybe I will ask you some advices. But I wanted to know the impact of anti-Semitism in this region, especially from the Romanian side, because exactions were, I think, worse than those which were done by the Nazis since 1938, I think, something like that. There was strong pogrom made by Romanian against Jewish population. What is the legacy of that today? There's some memorial in this area. I heard that the Romanian government was supposed to pay some damage to the Jewish community, but maybe a few Jews left there. So what do you know about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's true, it's so funny. Just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk about that question, namely that the paradox that a lot of Jewish survivors from the region actually remember the Germans as being the good guys, and the one of them even said that, as we descended into World War II, we knew that it was the Ukrainians and Romanians we should be fearing, not the Germans, because they thought, oh, as German speakers, we ourselves will be on the safe side. And actually that too was an illusion, obviously, but yes, Ukrainians and Romanians did perpetrate a lot of massacres here, for example, in 1940, even before the troops or the gendarmerie came in. And because the region remained under Romanian sovereignty, it was the Romanians who did kind of conduct the deportations into the camps in Transnistria rather than following just German orders. So there is something right to that. About the impact today, well, I think well, as I mentioned, right, the region is split now. So in the north, at least at the time that I was there, I personally didn't see that many monuments, right, to this. The one thing that I did see was that there were efforts increasingly to rehabilitate, for example, the old Jewish cemetery that had been left kind of prey to oblivion. By visitors, descendants of people who are returning now and trying to rebuild. As for the Romanian thing, I think it's still a very contested topic actually in Romania. There is now, a commission that investigated Romania's role in the Holocaust, but I would say it's not on the same level, the engagement with the issue that you find, let's say, in Poland by now. Yeah, so I have not seen actually any monuments.
Is there any museum there?
Yes, there is a Jewish museum in Chernivtsi. It's very
Kind of-
small and, sorry?
Yes, you mean, there is one museum there.
Yes, there is, yeah. It's very small, but it exists, and it actually located on the first floor of the former Jewish National House, because they got to build, there was this sort of competition, everybody needed to have their own national house, so they also built one in the center of the city in 1908. Then it became like a house for textile workers or something in the Soviet period, and now they reclaimed the first floor for the museum. In the south, I haven't heard of such a museum in the southern part.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating discussion. I'm curious to maybe hear you talk a little bit more about your understanding or the way that you use culture. I was really interested in the sort of kind of dual tensions you posit between these additive cultural projects versus the more like resurrectory ones. And then how that feeds into some of your interventions regarding how we understand the center versus the periphery. And it almost seemed like, to me, you're positing sort of a scenario in which the periphery becomes the most cultured or the most governed, if we think of like that as a literal verb, like it's, attracting the most kind of attention and effort. So yeah, then I was basically curious how you yourself define notions of culture in this context, and then how maybe your definitions and uses of culture vary from how your historical actors understood or use these terms, and if there's any difference there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The one thing that I noticed, what they all have in common is pretty much by culture, they actually mean like literacy, urbanization, or at least, having cities. In the Soviet case, actually, there's like a particular direction they move into, which is hygiene, things like that, that you didn't really hear being talked about before. But there are these common kind of tropes where everybody sort of means, or refers to the same things, but they have a different vision. The universalist one, a particularist one. Now, I'm not trying here to kind of posit a definition of my own. I looked at all of these different things, like at actual cultural policy, and also how people use the term, right, and then invoke it to make these claims. But what I found really interesting is this repeated or recurring concern with it, right? And sometimes the confusions that it leads to when locals hear a word or hear a language and they think it is the same thing as it was before because it sounds like it, but it's not. And this especially is the case, a lot of people who are in northern Bukovina when the Romanians return with their Nazi allies and hear talk of culture again, and hear the German language and think, we're familiar with this, right? We know this from the past. And then they have a really unpleasant surprise, right? This is a totally different vision, right? Even though it sometimes uses the same words or the same language. And so there's a lot of this history actually has to do with misreadings because of these echoes or rhymes, right? That people feel like, yeah, I'm familiar, I've heard it before. They expect something and then something totally different happens. And so there's kind of an illusion, right? That the same thing, we're just revolving through the same door, but actually something is changing and these states become more and more ambitious. And what they mean by this culture is broader and broader and more all-encompassing. So the Soviets, as you might know, now they go and like grab people from their beds to participate in elections. That's proof of being cultured, right? You can't just ignore. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I'm gonna use my purview as chair to ask the question.
which is that because I make a similar argument and also because we were trained by the same people and I recognize this argument, I'm interested in your argument about the way that locals seek to draw the state in. And in particular, you posit that this phenomenon, or rather, this is what I'm asking. Whereas many studies of the borderlands, you said, have viewed the populations there as perhaps apolitical or not eager to welcome in authorities in the way that you saw the people in Bukovina doing, you are seeing people actively seek to use the state to launch their search for inclusion. And I'm wondering basically to what do you attribute these invitations? When I think about them as the dawn of illiberal politics, for instance, in the center of the Soviet Union. But it seems to me that you're suggesting that this is a cyclical phenomenon that's happening with each new regime or form of governance that's coming. So I was hoping you could contextualize that move a bit.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And comparatively, expressly, how would you compare it to, you know, this authoritarian phenomenon?
Yeah.
Drawing the state in?
Yeah, so that's really interesting because in what I found, it definitely doesn't apply only to the authoritarian states. And it is cyclical. And one thing that I'm catching on to is with each regime change, right, there are those who have become deeply entangled with the previous state who are now like packing their stuff and fleeing because they are afraid of repercussions. But there are many who look to this as an opportunity, right, always. And opportunity is to finally put the place on the map, to get attention, to get resources. If you read, I mean, this is like a perpetual problem in the press, the local press, that you see just complaint after complaint. First of all, fears that we're sliding into a state of barbarism, right? Because they're, you know, like people measuring, for example, oh, so-and-so threw dishwater out the window in Chernobyl. We're sliding back into the lack of civilization. They don't do this all the time. And so they often look actually to state institutions to implement, right, this version of civilizational cultureness that they think should happen. And that moreover, for them, right, you should be able to fix this problem of being always the forgotten place. Or as they call it, they often use this expression that we're the stepchildren of this and that state. You know, the stepchildren of Austria. Then the stepchildren were, what do you call it, the Cinderella. That's my favorite. They were the Cinderella of the nation state. Because forgotten, exploited, and so on. Just, you know, authorities come in and go, and they never really have enough resources here. And so there is the cyclical dimension, and the motivation, I think, is also sort of this desire basically to no longer be peripheral, right, in a way. And there is a perception, actually going back to Larry's question, a lot of the people there that I see in the interwar period complain that, you know what, we always thought we were marginal, but now that marginality feels even worse than before. Being marginal in the nation state feels to them much worse, right, or has worse consequences than being a marginal province within this empire. So yes, cyclical phenomenon. And what is different is that as we move on, right, we move into the Soviet period, what's very different there is both the ambition on the part of the state, right, that with the Romanian nations, that I mean, it's just like a long history of frustration. You know, where, oh, let's do it, and then it doesn't work. And then it's 2 decades later and it still hasn't worked. And they're deeply frustrated by the time they leave. And you know, when they come back in 1941, the one thing that they say is, oh my God, we worked so hard here for 2 decades. These guys came in for just a few months and the place looks totally transformed, right? Because they have actually the instruments to do this. And so I remember one person was recalling how they went actually back to the theater or the cinema, and there was, you know, like a red star hanging in somewhere where there were tons of material, you know, piles and piles of just, you know, text that the Soviets had brought in that was just on a totally different scale from what the Romanians had done before. And so I think, yeah, that's what's different. I think both the ambition and the possibilities, right, that they have that the state before couldn't really. And so it just suffers, right, from this sense of impotence, which I think explains, on the question of anti-Jewish attacks. Again, in 1941, you have a similar scenario with returning Romanians now attacking Jews because they think that they invited the Soviets in. So now they become a kind of like a symbol of the Soviet occupation and sort of like foreign element threatening, right, Romanian rule there, rather than just the remainders of Habsburg rule. And so they just basically go around all these villages without getting any instructions explicitly from anyone, even from the beginning, and attacking all of these, slaughtering basically all of these Jewish communities. Because they see them as sort of infiltrators, I guess, or agents of the Soviet state. And that's part of, or that stuff from below that the people there are doing, then kind of feeds into the Romanian, the post 1941 Romanian state's attempt to redo that project of state building, but this time kind of saying, okay, so that didn't work, that version. Now we have to do something on the same scale that the Soviets did before us, or something even bigger. And that's where they begin to pull out the big guns, which is deportations, the whole deportations of people. Directly on the model of what the Soviets did.
So a phenomenological rather than an ideological.
Yes, I think so.
So I see we have some questions from Zoom. I think we'll consolidate them and then that will be our last question before we close. We have one from Alex Labuka. Did the quest for Ukrainian national identity in Galicia during the 19th century have any impact on Ukrainians living in Bukovina? And if so, what was it in conflict with the Romanian quest for national and cultural identity during that period? Was there cultural and ethnic tolerance under the Habsburgs in Bukovina?
Oh, yes, actually, the Ukrainian movement in Galicia had a lot to do with what was happening here. Ukrainian nationalists kind of looked at Bukovina as a sort of like less developed sister to Galicia in terms of Ukrainian national identity. And so, though the Ukrainian national movement did benefit majorly, right, from the fact that Ukrainians could move back and forth pretty easily under Habsburg rule between Galicia and Bukovina. And so a lot of national propaganda, for example, came in. There were one of the key Galician Ukrainian nationalists was this man, Stepan Smalstotsky, who came actually from Galicia, moved into Bukovina, and in fact, imported a lot of the questions that were really key to the Ukrainian movement in Galicia into Bukovina. So a lot of more like a combative attitude, all of it fueled by the conflict with the Poles, actually, in Bukovina. They didn't necessarily map out or like translate perfectly into Bukovinan conditions, but there was a really important link between the two. Galicia and as for if it was in what was it, if it was in conflict?
It was there a cultural and ethnic tolerance under the Habsburgs?
Oh,
in Bukovina?
that's a good question. Well, definitely by comparison with what happened later. But the one thing I wanted to touch on was this Romanian quest for national and cultural identity. That one before. What's really interesting about that is that these nationalists, I mean, they just constantly were also observing each other. And so I found very often Romanian nationalists kind of bemoaning, right, that, oh, the Ukrainians are better organized, they're doing all of this stuff, but we should copy them, right? And so we should do the same kind of clubs and organizations that they are doing. And so there's, again, emulation between the nationalists because they feel like in a way they complain about each other, but they also pay each other compliments indirectly by saying they're so much better than us in terms of organization, so we should borrow some of those tactics. So they actually inspire each other, even though they are in conflict, right, in terms of their claims. Now about the tolerance. Well, the one thing that I think is very tempting, right, when writing about the pre-1918 or pre-1914 period, actually, to get really nostalgic, right, about the place because of everything that came after. The one thing that I found actually was not necessarily like a picture of total harmony there with everybody being super happy, right, to live side by side. But again, a story about the importance of the institutions that contained those tensions, or basically contain the tensions or the conflicts, or channel them into newspaper columns and things like that, rather than the kind of pogroms and attacks, right, that would happen later. So one of the most surprising things for me was this, there is a Romanian politician who's very well known. His name was Aurel Onciu, who was a guy who attempted to negotiate a deal with the Ukrainians in 1918, basically saying, okay, you take northern Bukovina, we take southern Bukovina, and everybody will be happy. But it didn't work out. He actually ended up getting imprisoned by the Romanian army. The thing about this guy is he was actually a terribly anti-Semitic person. If you read his columns, he had a million different publications, writes the worst anti-Semitic stuff with caricatures and everything, right? But he's remembered actually as a very tolerant person, right? Because he negotiated with the Ukrainians. He was even part of this so-called national compromise, right? Which meant it was basically like an association of politicians, one Romanian, one Ukrainian, one Pole, and one Jewish politician, who came together and basically said, we are gonna run, or we will participate in elections for the local parliament as a group, right? And we will recognize each other's sort of national claims in order to be able to win votes. So there was that dimension, you know, where people did participate or collaborate, not necessarily because they were so enamored of each other, but because it was built into that kind of system that they needed to do that in order to win votes. And so you end up with seeming paradoxes, like the anti-Semitic Onciu being the biggest supporter for national recognition for Jews, for example, because it eventually would lead to the sort of national segregation he thought that he was dreaming of. Right, that if we recognize Jews as a separate national group rather than a subset of the Germans, it's going to work out also in our interest. By our, I mean the interest of Romania, actually. Yeah.
Cristina, thank you so much, and
Thank
thank you
you.
to all of you.